Good afternoon. I'm Robert Chaddock. I direct the advanced research activities of the National Archives Center for Advanced Systems and Technologies. It's my privilege this afternoon to welcome you all to Washington, D.C. and to our demonstration area here at the National Archives, where we're going to be learning of the findings and developments of research that is jointly supported by the National Archives and the National Science Foundation, investigating the application of advanced visualization tools to process electronic record collections of the government. It's my privilege this afternoon to welcome and to introduce my colleague, Dr. Maria Stava, from the Texas Advanced Computing Center and the University of Texas in her presentation of her current findings and results. So with that, Maria, it's a pleasure to welcome you to Washington, and we look forward to hearing your presentation this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I am delighted to present the first year of research, the results and developments of our first year of research at the Texas Advanced Computing Center. In this presentation, I will talk about the focus of our research, which is archival analysis, what is the nature of archival data, how we constructed an archives representation, a visual representation of archives, how have we been working on mapping archival theory and practices into this visualization, into this visual representation. Then I will talk about the user studies that we did in order to see whether our visual representation was cohesive and consistent with archival theories and practices, and specifically with archival analysis processes. And then we will talk about two case studies: visual exploration of preservation, of archives preservation, and visual exploration of archival arrangement or organization. And then I will just discuss conclusions and ongoing work. So, I'm sorry, I will go back to the presentation. So the focus of our research, we focus our research on mapping archival analysis processes with visualization, or how visualization can help archivists to conduct analysis processes for large and heterogeneous data collections. So we ask ourselves, what do we do as an archivist? I am an archivist. What do we do when we analyze collections? What are the processes? What are the cognitive processes and the thinking processes that we go through as we analyze collections? Analysis of archival collections are at the core of many of the, of almost all the processes that archivists go through when they appraise archives, when they evaluate the preservation condition of the archives, when they make decisions about storage, about access, when they describe, arrange collections. So these analysis processes are at the core of any of the archival functions. And in this way, we decide, well, with the prospect of large and heterogeneous collections, how are we going to map this process into information visualizations that are useful for archivists to conduct this analysis? So we use data mining and statistics to run these analysis processes, and we use a visual representation as an interface between the archivist and the analysis. The visualization not only represents the archive, but it also represents the results. And so the archivist uses this interface to connect with the data, connect with the results of the analysis process. That's the core. I have to tell you that all of these images that you see are not decorations. They are the archives. They are the archives represented in this case as a tree map visualization. So what do we do? What do archivists do when they look at collections? We conducted interviews and a user study and user experience studies, and we asked archivists, what do you do when you analyze electronic records collections? There's a lot of literature about frameworks for description, for appraisal of records, but the cognitive processes that archivists go through, they're not described at all. So I have, this is like in the form of a text cloud. The big letters highlight what archivists do more. They read, they use secondary sources, they listen to audio recordings, they observe, they look at labels, they analyze the structure of the collection, how this collection is arranged in groups and subgroups. They look into the file properties, file formats, extract metadata. They do all of these things when they analyze a collection. But mainly, the important thing is that these are all the tasks that they conduct. But they do high-level inferences using the archives as their evidence, as the materials that they are looking at, and with their own experiences or putting their own experiences at their knowledge, and also reading or learning about the secondary sources, about where these archival collections are coming from, where they have been created, why they have been created, what their function is. They make inferences about the collection in order to describe them for the public to access them. So once we went through understanding what archivists do and what are the methodologies that they use to conduct analysis, we now talk about the data that we're using. What is archival data? And for our research, we use cyber, which are the records that are stored at the National Archives, a testbed collection that the National Archives has for researchers like us to use. It's a huge collection of records belonging to all the federal agencies. These are public records that have been either harvested from the web or that have been given by the different federal agencies to understand what the future systems for the archives will be. So we use at this point a portion of this collection. So archival records are absolutely varied, not only in file format but also in structure. You can think about them as data objects, the record being the unit of analysis. Is a complex or a very simple data object, but it completely varies. Not only it varies in relation to the group of records to which it belongs, but also within a group of records, or within a records group, you can find variations between one to the next. And one of the interesting challenges that archivists face is in this, in the area of electronic records, is to distinguish what a record is from a group of files. What is the formation? What is the conformation of a record, of a complex record? The relationship between files and records is not necessarily one-to-one, it's one-to-many, and the structure in which these records are contained is very varied. And the reasons why these structures exist will have to do with many different reasons, one being the function of the records, the software in which the records were created, or just a decision of the archivist of what constitutes a record of a transaction. So what we decided to do is that we decided to take it all in. We decided, as opposed to looking at a specific type of record, we decided to take all of these records in, all of these varied records belonging to all of these different agencies, and we assume no previous knowledge about the collection. This collection is not cataloged. We don't have external metadata about the collection. So we decided to see to what extent these methodologies would help us learn about the collection, what meaningful metadata, what meaningful inferences we could make about the collection as a whole, as opposed to learning because somebody has analyzed these records and externally given an order to the records and described the records. What can we infer just from the data, data-driven methods? So those are our main points. So what about the representation? So the first concern was how to represent the archive. How do we represent electronic records collection? So we decided to use tree maps. Tree maps are a very established way of representing hierarchical data, tree-like structured data. And given the structure, the logical structure in which records are being organized, we decided to use tree maps. We produced extensive modifications in order to be able to really represent the structure of records, and I will talk about that a little bit more. But what we use to represent, what we use as a basic metadata to represent the records are the structural metadata. This is the file paths of each of the records in the file system, in the storage system in which they are. We also use the file properties, file size, file numbers, aggregated at different levels of abstraction and at different levels of organization, at the different levels of organization in which the records are, the different directory levels. So we also used classification methods. We would further classify records and in classes according to the file formats. We use ontologies that are well known also in regards to preservation, for example. And we further abstract the information. Considering that we are going to analyze such a huge amount of records, we needed to find meaningful ways of abstraction and synthesis that on the one hand would not be so general that we will lose total perspective, but we don't want also to get lost in the details. And archivists are prone to look into details. So the details, so the abstraction had to be very meaningful. They cannot be just, generalizations. And that is something that we are, always working on. So we wanted it to be highly interactive. We wanted the archivist to immerse himself or herself in the data and be able to to investigate it with flexibility. We wanted to map the dynamics of the analysis process, the back and forth, which we go through as we think about records. How we find something and then we think, oh, we should look into this other thing. So it's a very dynamic process. It's not necessarily a linear process, but a dynamic process. So we wanted to give that flexibility. We also wanted the representation to be to afford decision making, decision making processes, and we wanted to give the possibility to be a collaborative process, so in which one or two or more archivists could work together, could look at the visualization, could work with the visualization together in order to make these conclusions. It needs to be scalable. And we use an iterative design process in which we work with archivists and preservation administrators from campus in our design. We use, our workflow is very simplistic here. We have storage of electronic records collections. We have some part of the collection is stored locally at TAC. We also access the collection remotely. We extract the metadata. We use a relational database management system to do all the mappings and the aggregations and all the queries, which is a very efficient method. Both the tree map is a very efficient method to show big quantities of data, and the relational database management is very efficient because we only have metadata about the collection. And then we render visually. So let's see a little bit our first. So first I will talk about the representation, how we decided to represent the archives as a whole. And I will sit down just because I have to maybe stop this. This is a video. And you will think this is funny, but that little dot, here you have all the records, all the federal records, all the million records are represented as a tree map. And what you start to see is that every big square represents a federal agency. Within that federal agency, you can find many different record groups depending on the function of that federal agency. And these record groups here are, at this point, we're representing all the tree structure. What you start seeing a lot of different patterns and a lot of different, patterns and figures that are being shown. When we go to the first level, and I'm going to stop here, each one of these squares is one federal agency. And you can see the tree map is structured in a way in which the size of that square represents the number of files that that federal agency has. The color is divided in 5 percentiles so that you can see how many records, or the range of files, that are represented by each one of these colors, of this range of colors. And for visual consistency, we just divided into 5 percentiles as opposed to having each one on a different range, because it would have been very difficult to understand. So you can see which record collections are bigger than others, which are the smallest ones, which is something that is important for comparison and contrast. And I will keep moving. You can also decide, or you can also look into ranges, so to understand the precise numbers of files that each collection has. Then with tooltips, you can better investigate the different statistics for every record group, and you have all the information about, that's the record group of the geology, or the USGS. And with the tooltip, you can select the different views. You can select size of files, number of files, type of file format, if it's images, if they're videos. And so you can see in a broad view what the content of each one of the record groups is. As you move on, because it was important to understand the structure of the records, which means the structure of the records shows the relationship between groups of records in a collection. So we really needed to represent that as well. So you can go to the different levels of nesting, and you will start seeing how the collection is represented at different levels of nesting. And you can see the distribution and compare and contrast the distribution of, in this case, images, number of images in the collection. You can see where there are images, where there are not images, and which collections have more and less images, and how they are distributed, forming these regular or irregular patterns. This is just another view. The visualization, now we're going back to none, meaning we're not showing any properties, we're just showing the structure. These are just interactive features. You can zoom, you can pan, you can focus on a certain group, and you can start seeing how the records are distributed. And these, for example, are websites. And we have features to understand what the components, or what the different components of the structure is, and within the size and the type of file formats, or the class of file formats. These general views are important just to compare and contrast within all the record collections, but then you can go and focus on, for example, one specific record groups, which is what we are doing here. We can focus on any part of the node, on any part of the tree, and in this case we're looking at USGS Geological Survey record groups, specifically water resources discipline, and all of these are different GIS experiments. within the structure of the GIS records that have a very, very, hierarchical particular structure, we can see where there are images in the collection. We can conduct searches to understand what the units are. For example, where are the documentation folders located or the image folders located? And this is just a way to understand what's in the records in a large scale. This is just a grouping of records that has GIS data. And as you can see, the structure is very diverse. Here you can see also there's a very interesting uniformity. You have GIS types of records both in big and smaller quantities, but in a very uniform way. And each one of these units constitutes an experiment, one GIS experiment, one GIS observation. And all of that we could infer just by looking at the structure of the records, looking at the visualization. So, and the different views, if you use the search with the different views of the types of records within, you can determine what the component of that group of records is and how it is organized or how it is structured, how the records are organized, which is something that archivists do in order to give access to their to the collections. So once we finish with the basic representation of the archive with all its components, all these different record groups that compose the federal records collections, the entire, or a sample of the federal records collections, we wanted to understand whether this was a representation that was useful to archivists. So we stopped right there with that representation and we conducted user experience studies. What we learned is that in information visualization, there are very few really user experience studies. There are a lot of usability studies, but user experience studies are harder to accomplish. And the reason for this is because the visualization, the information visualization, is a tool that aids researchers or users to conduct research. And so it is very difficult to map that onto a usability study that basically measures tasks. And research is really not a task, cannot be measured as a task. So there are very few studies, and the studies indicate the difficulty of mapping the cognitive processes that the researcher goes through to a quantitative, you did this in 10 minutes or you didn't do it in 10 minutes, this is successful or this is not successful. So what we did was that we divided our study into, well, we asked archivists to come to our visualization lab at the Texas Advanced Computing Center. They were able to conduct a study for 2 hours, and what we did was, in order to phase out usability from user experience tests, we divided our study in exploratory tasks, which are just to learn whether the archivist understood or not the system or the software. Discovery tasks that are a little bit more high-level tasks, such as understanding patterns and looking at discovering patterns in the visualization. And then inferential tasks, which are understanding what the record's functions are or making more high-level inferences about the collection, which is what is the highest level of analysis that archivists go through. We also wanted to test collaboration. We did a background questionnaire to understand the levels in which archivists had experience with electronic records and what type of electronic records, because here, remember, in the National Archives, in the federal records agencies, we have all sorts of types of records, from GIS records to census data to just plain text data or images or video. So we wanted to know what their expertise was. We used Likert scale, and we built in a little bit of redundancy, which is something that is recommended in these types of studies. So what we learned throughout the experience, we tested basically 3 questions: whether this was a good how useful this representation was, useful is not the good way, how this representation was consistent with certain archival theories and practices, whether the representation was consistent with archival theory and practices, with certain points that are very keen to archivists: original order, provenance, record type, structure, context, whether they could conduct the analysis methods that they told us that they conduct: compare and contrast, identify visual patterns, classify, identify dependencies, groups that they usually use in order to analyze records, and whether they felt that the visualization was useful for them to conduct certain archival tasks, such as appraisal, description, preservation planning, as a visual finding aid. So what we found in general was that we had high ratings in almost all of the questions, but the most difficulty was found in the more inferential tasks. So, for example, to appraise, which is such a subjective task that archivists conduct, in which they don't only use the records as evidence, looking at the records as evidence, but they also consider the institutional goals or the financial possibilities to acquire and store records, and to identify, appraisal being such a subjective. They found that the visualization was not as useful as when doing the other types of analysis. So in general, this was what we found overall in all of the I'm sorry, I will go back. In all of the studies, is that here the same, the same, even though it's all very highly rated, but we also find that, that the generalized, for example, archivists are trained to look at records individually, at groups of records individually, and so for them to find general patterns, to find patterns that can go across different types of record groups is a little bit more hard. And so the visualization was not as useful for them to do this. The other point that happens is that really they were not able to test this for more than 2 hours per time. So we think that this is one of the things that we really need to improve. They need to come and have much more time to get themselves acquainted with the visualization, and also they need to go through a different process. All of a sudden they came into the room. They had to, for the first time, see archives represented as a visual metaphor and use the visual metaphor to conduct their tasks, or the tasks. So we are thinking about how to improve the studies. So after this, after learning that in fact it was the archivists considered that the representation was a sound representation in general, we decided to focus on 2 use case studies. The preservation case study was our first way to determine, or our first case study to determine whether analysis at large scale analysis at large scale of records collection could be done using the visualization. So for this, we invited to our group a group of preservation administrators to work with us on the design of the visualization, to specify the requirements for that specific preservation case study. And we use what's called in preservation, digital preservation, file format characterization information. This is, we use file format, we evaluate file format characterization information, which is a combination of file format identification, metadata, plus what you would call institutional criteria on the range or the sustainability of records. This is how you evaluate a file format in terms of how sustainable it will be to maintain that file format throughout the future. So that conforms characterization information, and this is the information that the archivist would look into in order to make recommendations for its preservation. So you saw already the first representation. In this case, again, all of the records collections are represented as a tree map, but the colors are changing. And what you see here is a color representing a course assessment, a very broad assessment of the preservation condition of that group, of that record group. We also wanted to know what we don't know about the collection. So you have certain areas, like for example, this black area is telling us that we do not know anything about, we don't have characterization information for that group of records. And the white areas tell us that we do know what file format they have, but we don't have an institutional criteria about whether that format is acceptable or not for the institution, whether they can support its long-term preservation. So all of this is a very coarse first assessment that is based on the aggregation of the characterization information. As we go in, this guides the archivist into the analysis. When we see red, it means that it's high risk. When we see green, it's low risk. And then when we see tile and blue, the levels of risk are medium. And all of this is based on established sustainability criteria elaborated by the Library of Congress and the Stanford Digital Repository. So we borrowed an ontology, an existing ontology, to test our method. As you go in, these course assessments become more detailed. When you click on each one of the groups, you can obtain distributions or risk distributions. And I'm going to stop so I can show you. So for each one of the record groups and structures, you have file distributions, file format distribution, and risk distributions that give you in detail the reasons for this color. And we tested whether this was consistent, going from more high-level information to more detailed information, and whether the transition made sense, especially in terms of color and sizes. And then once we get that high-level course assessment or general assessment, the archivist can go directly into comparing and contrasting with the different record groups. So we we have this aggregator in which a preservation administrator can use variables, all the risk variables, and for example, whether for them the criteria of assessing risk or size or type of file format is important in their assessment, so they can aggregate these, and there's a weight. They can weight according to the importance that their institution gives to a certain preservation variable, and understand by comparison which collections have one or more of these variables. And the colors correspond to collections that have all of them, and then in degrees of yellow you will have the score or the score in which these variables are represented. I have to say, of course, that it is kind of difficult to show all of these things at the same time, but and that, of course, all of these systems have a period of adjustment or a period of understanding what they do. In this case, we move from the aggregator view to a selector view, and this, I think, is the more valuable for an archivist, because it will allow filtering certain variables. So let's say that I am, concerned about collections that are of high level risk, that have all these file formats that are not sustainable from the perspective of my institution. So I want to also consider collections that have more of these files at risk, and also I want to consider collections that have, images, because that is important for my establishing preservation condition. So I can filter these variables and just, just understand which collections have those characteristics, the characteristics that I consider or that my institution considers of high risk or more priority, and the reverse also, which ones are in best condition, which ones have the best file formats, which ones I don't have to really, act upon. So these are different tools to allow archivists to make decisions, and also to be able to compare and contrast in order to establish priorities. These maps with what frequently archivists do when they have to determine what to do with the collections and what to prioritize next. So these are, one view is for discovery purpose, and the other view is more for decision-making purposes and filtering variables. And you can see visually, and then you can, of course, identify what collection or what record group we are talking about. All of these general views can also, all of these same functions translate into the small record groups. So you might want to compare all the record groups of the federal agencies, or you might want to just go within each record group, and within each record group all the different record groups. So for example, this is a case study of the records of the public debt. This is a collection of reports, monthly reports, and using the visualization at that level of detail, you can basically identify which subdirectories contain files at high risk, which file directories contain files that we don't know what the characterization criteria for them are, and also which files are at lower risk. One of the issues that we were concerned about is that up to now we have this assessment done at the file level, meaning we don't know from these which are files and which are records, what constitutes a record. So using the visualization, we were able to identify, using the other features that we talked about first, we were able to identify where are the records located, which is the unit of analysis, what is a record. And because this is a relational database and we have the nodes IDs, we could identify, in this case, this is a very simple case, but each subdirectory constitutes a record, and we could get back from the database the information about the preservation information for the records as opposed to the information for the files. Using the visualization, so here is the result. Using the visualization, we were able to get that feedback. We determined what constitutes the record. We gave the root ID back to the relational database, and as opposed to learning that this collection has 1,000 files, some of which are at high risk and some of which are at low risk, we now get an assessment of each record, 900 records as opposed to 1,000, more than 1,000 records, more than 1,000 files. So we have 900 records, some of which have more than one file format within, and each file format will have its own level of risk. And we can detect exactly which ones are at risk and which ones are not at risk according to the criteria. So this is something that we did for various record groups, and what we measured constantly was whether the transitions from the high-level abstraction to the small detail were consistent and were not misleading, because we are always working with abstractions and abstractions and abstractions, and we don't want to miss again, it's a balance between having a high-level overview, a general overview of the conservation state, that because we abstracted so much, when we get to the details, they don't map. So that's one of the things that we are working on, and working on how to, from the visualization, since we don't know anything about the collection a priori, we do not know the structure of the records, whether the visualization is useful for us to identify a record structure and put it back into the relational database and have the information at a record level as opposed to at a file level. So this has been one of our so that was one of our case studies, and we concluded that we could make preservation recommendations based on this assessment. And then we explored also arrangement. So arrangement, description of records is a big part of what archivists do, determine how they are arranged and describe them so that the public can access them. When you have these high quantities of records, and especially records that are so highly structured, it's very hard to assess the arrangement. So we use unsupervised methods and data mining in order to infer the way in which records are arranged. We use structural metadata. This is all the file path metadata. We did first an observation of the directories and file names to understand how in general these records are arranged, and we observed that, of course, temporal, time, names, subjects, people and places are highly used to organize records. And so we decided to use unsupervised methods again. We parsed the file names. We use natural language processing tools to infer word senses. In this case, for this case that I'm going to show you, it was temporal and spatial, this means geographical location, to be more precise, and then time, months, years, etc. We also observed that there were many records organized sequentially, and also many records organized by common file names. Once we get these, we use alignment algorithms. We use biological sequence alignment algorithms to infer the arrangement, and we cluster the information so that we can present the different types of arrangement in different views, in different record views, and we render the results visually. So I just want to show you the different types of sequence alignment that we get. here in this case we have April, February, so this is April, February, December. These are all indications of time, because if we do an if we use the alignment algorithm, because June and December are different words, we will get non-alignment. So in this case, the words are transformed into equivalent signs so that they align perfectly well. The same happens with when we detect words that belong to places. And then here, the sequencing alignment, and I'm sorry, this is sequencing alignment. As you see, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 2, there's a sequence going on. And here, there's a pattern with regards to the file name. So nav, 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 there are similarities in the file name, which is also very much used in archival file name, well, in records file naming. So here is a demonstration of the how this works. In this case, we have all the federal records again, and here we decide to understand, well, what groups of records are organized by similarities in their names. And you can see that a lot. There's a lot of records that people use the same file name convention within each, of course, no? Same file naming convention. Sequential arrangement. There are less. And in order to really understand what happens within one record group, we go to one record group, and this will make it clearer for you. We update it. And so, for example, here we have records of the Bureau of Census. When we click on the records of the Bureau of Census, we see that this yellow indicates that there's a high score for arrangement of records based on a similar name convention. So what this means is that the records within this group are arranged by name. So these are records of the census. If we go to the next level, within that, you will see here summary file, congressional districts, summary file. So that means, and congressional districts, it means that these files have a high score based on the way that they are named, on the similarity between the ways that the records are named. In this case, it shows what's underneath. In this other case, we are going to look into, well, this is another case of the same type of study. And this is important because the fact that these records have been all named in the same way means that they belong to a same grouping, and that there's a relationship between them. And maybe possibly also that instead of being just individual files, they are conform one record. This is another case of sequential arrangement. Here you can see that each one of these individual subdirectories and the records within are arranged sequentially. The files within are arranged sequentially. And this is going to be the end, just to show you how the sequence, how the arrangement is sequential. this is again. So I cannot stop the video and make it go again, but I hope we're making the point. The different range in yellows mean that, so in order to show these visually, all the data has to be transformed into a number. So according to the degree in which the similarity or the sequence similarity or the name similarity is uniform, you will have a different degree of color. So you can find highly sequentially arranged records or not that highly sequentially arranged records. And this is important for decision making, or do we need to arrange these records? How is the organization of these records? Are they organized or they are not organized, just to start with? This next, and is the last, here, in this case, what we have clustered are both temporal, so here you have spatial, temporal, and both. So this shows the record groups that have been arranged spatially, temporal here, and by both, with both temporal and spatial arrangements are shown in gray. So here you will see. So for example, if you look, you will see, South Plate, New England, South Dakota, New Jersey, Connecticut, North Carolina. So all of this has been detected by the WordNet, or the natural language processing, and we can infer that we can assert that the records are arranged by geographical location in this case. And here, when we see green, you see September, Hurricane Katrina, September. And that means that it's organized by date. We still have to work on, well, I will explain more as you see. March, December. So all of this group of records are arranged by date. And here we can see a highly so as you have seen, spatial arrangement is one very frequent way in which records are arranged. And we have to work a lot yet on the parsing algorithms, because there's a lack of course, all of these records, all of these files and records are named differently by the different agencies. So there's a lot of work going on how the parsing algorithm should parse these names. And for example, whether when we find sequentially arranged 2009, 2010, 2011, whether 2009 corresponds to year, or whether 2009, 2010 corresponds to any type of sequential order that doesn't have anything to do with year. So there's a huge work on data mining and parsing and doing very intelligent parsing in order to be more precise. But we have been very pleased that we can use these methodologies to make sense of records that are otherwise a bit of a mystery, and at this large scale. So so we have looked into, just to wrap up, we have looked into a representation, a way of representing huge types of huge collections. a way to understand the relationships between these groups of records and between records themselves. We want to work, we have worked on different applications, a preservation application and records organization application to infer preservation condition of collections and also to determine how they are arranged. We really want to work now on enabling additional visual features. I mean, we think that the tree map has been very useful, but we don't think that is the only way to represent records. This has been useful for us at this point for what we have done. We also want to better map visualization to archival theory and practices. We have worked a lot on that, and we have, after we did the user studies, we got enormous feedback, and we changed and we improved some of the features, but we still have to better map the cognitive processes that archivists go through when they conduct analysis. We want to explore more the collaborative use of the visualization. That was the best feature of all when we conducted the user studies. People enjoyed talking and discussing patterns and non-patterns, looking at the visualization and making conclusions. And, well, we need to, of course, keep working on perfecting the unsupervised methods. You know, we have worked with a testbed collection of 3 million files so far, and we need to scale it up because we really think that this is a very short time to present everything, but we really think that when we have more and more examples, we will be able to better understand patterns. In a way, what we figure is whether at some point we can use this as a diagnostic, whether the patterns repeat themselves for certain types of records or for certain patterns of organization. At this point, we cannot really assert that. We have to mix the visual perception of order or disorder of these are records of a website, these are records of GIS records, these are observational records or with a certain pattern. We don't have, and we have to also run the data mining algorithms to see how they map, to see how the perception of organization agrees or not with the real organization, or I mean with the real score, organization score. And that is something that we haven't done yet. But we want to pursue that path and see whether we really find, you know, patterns of organization, disorganization, or patterns of types of records with a specific, you know, if we can find patterns for types of records. So that's what we are working on now. This is the team, ATTAC, and the collaborators. We work with students from computer science. Dr. Weisha, who is a specialist in visualization and data analysis. All of the Suyuk, Pradeep, Varun, and Jay are and have been our students. We work in close contact with Robert Chaddock and Mark Conrad and Rick for all the questions and feedback, and really their feedback has this has been 1 year in which we started with you know, with ideas, well, what can we do with records analysis, but we really couldn't, you know, it was crucial for us to communicate with them in order to target our research. And then our colleagues at the University of Texas Libraries who work with us on preservation, on the preservation aspect of the visualization. So now I am open to clarifications because I think we have rushed over this, and I don't know if you...
Dr. Stava, thank you. Thank you. As you have been presented, please, well deserved. As Dr. Stava has presented this afternoon, what you see is inherently a multidisciplinary collaboration where we brought together some of the best perceptions of a research project led by an archivist, informed by archival principles and the practices of visual inspection, but translated to be supported in the context of visualization. The other piece that you see in this is that the utility of this work is also informed by the specific technical attributes of test collections, including electronic record collections from a broad variety of federal agencies. The last piece we will also see in this is the aspects that this research basically is a collaboration that is possible because of the investments of multiple agencies. The National Science Foundation's investments and the nation's investments in the Texas Advanced Computing Center, the contributions of multiple agencies that have contributed data, and also the expertise that really is reflected in the fact that this research is informed because of the world stage of research and developments that are ongoing today. So in that respect, it has all of the collaborations of what we believe is a very stellar collaboration that is of direct utility to archivists, and lastly is led by an archivist. So with that, thank you all.